and get where it needs to go. Put this screw in place. Well, the magnetism of the meat is dragging that screw away all the time. That's why I'm having so much trouble. Run that down lightly. There's a second screw in here. Now this almost certainly gets jammed up against it, and you'll need to pull it back to get at that screw. Get this screw in place. That looks fine. Tighten that screw up too. I'm going to try the top cover on there. I haven't cleaned the top cover yet, but I want to make sure that everything else is looking good. Let's get a shutter release button on there. That feels a bit snug. Might be a bit of friction there. Yeah, no, that'll be alright. Let's try the top cover. Now I want to make sure that the frame counter moves smoothly and only counts one frame at a time. Well, those numbers aren't very well centered up, so it's like it's throwing slightly too far. So I'll just wind this screw in slightly and check again. That's good, those numbers are centered up nicely. The shutter release, I'm not very happy with that. That's not exactly popping back up very freely. I'll take the meter off and have a look at that. I think it's just rubbing on the front of the meter housing here. No, it's not. It's something to do with this button here is rubbing on the case. Okay. Sometimes the shutter release can be slightly bent. Try moving it around 180 degrees. And putting it back. Often that can make a big difference. Let's try that. No, if anything that's worse. But it is rubbing. There's no problem there in the camera. It's got to be in the top. So I've got to clean this top cover anyway. Make sure that I've got all the dirt and grime out of there. I haven't cleaned any of that yet. Is there anything in here? Not that you'd notice. Anything odd about the button? Again, there's nothing there to particularly notice. It means that the top cover is probably not fitting as well as it might do. I'm having a look at it. Sometimes it's effectively too far forward or too far back, depending on how the sides of the cover are splayed out. It's like it's coming up against a hard stop there. Yeah, it's sticking down in the camera now quite clearly. It's not being lifted up. It should be lifted up on its spring to this height, and it's sticking down there. So something is causing friction down there. Yeah, I'm just going to close the front of the camera. I don't want to lose that sleeve out of there. I'll pull this out and look at it. Giving that a wipe. It only had molybdenum paste on there, and not very much. It shouldn't have made it sticky. It's certainly sticking. It's like it's pushing against the front of the housing here. What's that like if I rotate it? Something's not in line. Cameras have often been dropped, and one of the things that often happens when they're dropped on their heads. The shutter release can be pushed one side or the other, ends up bending things. See, that's good now. So I'll pop this back together and see how it goes. That's how it should move. It should be free. Yeah, its shaft's not really lining up very well. That's better. Let's try that. See what happens. Now it's rubbing on the case there. It's like the case needs to move forward on that. So I'll pull in this front wall. And it's too far over that way. Can the top be shifted? Well, we're constrained at this end against that meter. That's the fixing point at that end. I'll push the meter as far outboard as it will go. No, it's still not doing it. So I'm going to have a look at that. That shutter release shaft may be slightly bent. It moves freely in the body now, but it's rubbing in the top. I need that to pop up freely every time. No arguments. Well, that shutter release was certainly not going to be beaten by any half measures of mine. I had to replace the shaft. It's slightly bent and I just could not straighten that up and make it run nicely. So I've replaced that with another one. And I also fitted an extra return spring in there, the spring that is sometimes fitted. You could just about see it in there, I think, if I hold this camera right. Yes, you can just see it there. Let me get my pointer on it. Right down there, there's a little coil spring, a fine spring, and that lifts that lever, that shaft directly. That spring's not present on all of the retinas by any means, and usually it causes no problem at all. In this case, there's enough misalignment between the body and the top of the casting, the hole in the top of the casting, and the two holes that are on the bracket on the side of the shroud that guide that shutter release, and between them it's just enough. It's just enough to cause grief. It stops that shutter release from moving smoothly. It can certainly be depressed easily enough, but the little spring on the base is just too lackluster to lift it up, and I want it to lift up. So there, that's done. I need to clean up this top housing. I'll just take the 3 screws out of the accessory shoe, keeping a lot of downward pressure on that screwdriver to make sure it doesn't cam out. I'll end up scarring that chrome brass. The satin chrome marks very easily. So I'll remove the 2 screws that hold that mask in position. There's the return spring for the frame counter. There's the mask. The glass for the little rangefinder window, the glass for the viewfinder window, and the 2 standoffs, and the other screw. Where's the other one? There it is. That meter dial, I will take that apart. The pin spacing on that is exactly the same as for the rewind knob on these cameras. So if I find the tool for that, I'll be right. And it's not the same on a Retina 3 Big C. So be aware of that. This screw is particularly easy to break. Chromed brass, it's quite thin, and if you over tighten it you'll shear that screw off, and you won't enjoy that because it's going to be very difficult to find another one. It'll have to come off another 3 small C. That moves quite freely, I'm pleased to see that. So I'm going to remove all that old grease. This lever moves the follower needle, and it follows this cam shape in here. So it's important that that moves freely, and obviously we don't want grit and other rubbish underneath this knob making that stiff. So I'm checking to make sure that moves very smoothly. And all of this now I just need to clean down with a bit of naphtha and a cotton bud, clean the glass in the normal way and put it all back together. Well, now we've got a nice sparkly top cover to go with the rest of it. So I'll pop that into place. That all appears to work nicely. There's three chrome-plated screws that hold this in place. 2 at the rewind knob end of the top cover. Just checking everything's seated correctly. Looks good. 1 here. Right on the end of the top cover. That's not starting, it can't be seated properly. Let's have another go. That's better. that's our top cover in place. That all looks nice and tidy. So what about the rewind? Well, we've got the little spacer that goes on the top. And the piece that we're most interested in here was the state of the wavy washer. So I'll give this a wipe with some synthetic grease. Pop that over the top, run the screw in, do that up tight, check that that film reminder dial turns, screw that in, make sure that the rewind knob lifts all the way up to two-stage action. That's good. That's the camera body dealt with. But of course the camera body wasn't the headline problem with this camera, it was the shutter. So next I've got to strip down and service the shutter, which I've got sitting here. So this shutter, right, let's start from the outside. Let's get rid of our retaining ring, the shims, the rear lens group, the front lens group. Pop those to one side. Won't be needing to see those for a little while. Let's have a look at the back here. We've got 3 screws hold the case on, the outer case. Have those out. I'm pleased to see they're all present because lately I've been striking a few where one of the 3 is missing. Typically this one, which is the smallest and hardest to replace. Now this screw clamps the flash contact firmly. We'll have that off. So now we've got the outer case, the curved rack and the pusher, the piece that the curved rack moves, which then in turn pushes on this cocking tab here. And I notice, looking at this, that's somewhat bent. So that's had a hard life. There's paint scuffed off there too, so yes, bad things have happened to that. Into the shutter from the front. We have a locking screw here. Very small, very easily lost. That screw holds the retaining ring, stops it from unscrewing, or for that matter from being tightened up too much. We'll run off our retaining ring. We have the lens mount. Here's the aperture numbers ring that telegraphs the numbers from the bottom of the shutter to the top, because the action actually couples to the bottom. Here is the shutter speeds setting ring, and here's the little tab underneath it that couples to the diaphragm to set the aperture, and that little pin there. Shutter speed settings cam plate, that sets our speeds. This little lever here stops you being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter's not actually cocked. We'll just take that little pinion out, that cocks the main spring. Here's the internal, I think of this as the internal cocking rack. This is the piece that cocks that main spring. This is cocked by the pusher on the outside of the shutter, and I'm going to have to straighten that up. So in from here, we can remove the shutter release. I'm going to, interestingly here, the main cam is not back at the rest position. It should be round a bit further, round to there. That was quite stiff and didn't want to go. I'll remove its spring. Its spring is very tired. The spring, the arms of the spring, if you take this at 12, this should be sitting at 2. It's sitting at about 330. So it's very tired. That means that at the end of the stroke, when it's almost back at the rest position, where this is quite stiff, the spring lacks much tension because there's not enough distance between this pin here and this pin here. So it's particularly noticeable. You have problems when the shutter gets a bit sticky, it doesn't want to fully close, and that's exactly the situation here. The other fault I'm noticing is that this is very stiff, this action. There's a lot of friction between the retard gear train here and this cam, which suggests that that wasn't lubricated particularly well, or that the lubrication is all given up the ghost. Regardless of that, we can have the main cam out because all problems will be rectified. 2 screws hold the retard gear train in place. That's quite tight. So is that. These screws are quite small. If they're unusually tight, it probably means that someone was pushing their luck when they were assembling it last time. The 2 speed trains, the self-timer and the retard gear train, I'll put those aside. They're going to be clean in the ultrasonic cleaner. I'll start dismantling this part. This is the latch that holds the main cam in the cocked position. And this mechanism underneath it also forms the parts of the flash synchronisations parts. Now, here I've got to be careful to recover little springs like that, which are easily lost if they ping off into the distance. That's our moving flash contact. Let's pull that spring back out, that screw rather, back out of there before I get into trouble. Let's remove this piece. This spring loads part of the flash sync mechanism. I need to unhook this spring, so I need a pair of pliers to do that. My favourite tool for this job is this pair of bent nose pliers. So I've put something behind that arm to stop it swinging back. Then I can grab that spring. You only have to stretch it out a tiny amount to unhook it, and so I don't have to overstress that spring. If you don't hold the arm from moving, you have to stretch the spring out a long way because the arm keeps moving back while you're trying to unhook it. It'd be very frustrating. You end up stressing the spring out. Right, remove some more of this. This screw here with a spring on it holds the B lever in position. It's the pivot for the B lever. The spring on it acts against the arm on the settings lever for the flash sync. There's a spring here, a turn spring for the B lever, and that's on a post. There's a groove around the post that that spring sits into. So I'll just unhook that. One more fine spring to come out. It's on this lever, and I put a toothpick over the centre so that the spring can't get away. And then I can unhook the spring, and then I can carefully lift the spring up and put it to one side. That spring is exceptionally good at getting away. Very fine. Anything like that that's frequently lost, frequently has been lost. So there tend to be no spares readily available. Everyone's already used them up. Into the shutter from the back. 3 screws hold the settings lever for the aperture. that comes off. This is very oily. This shim should be nice and dry, but it's not. And this is the setting lever for the flash sync speeds and the self timer. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. They're all identical. Right, we can lift off the case. So here we have our case with the diaphragm in there. Those blades are quite oily. You can see that shine on those blades. That's oil. What happens with oily diaphragm blades is that it tends to stick the blades together. This is really stiff to move. Inevitably, you may find that it'll work fine on a hot day when the oil is nice and thin and runny. On a cold day, the viscosity goes right up and that just sticks like glue. So when you pull on the lever to change the aperture, you end up damaging the blades because something's got to give. The mechanism plate here with the shutter blades on it. Well, there's an awful lot of silvery lines around that. Now that's almost certainly graphite powder or something that's got onto there. That shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't see a circle round those blades. So that's something odd. Probably someone squirted graphite powder in there, perhaps in an attempt to free things up, when really what was required was that the shutter should have been completely stripped down and cleaned. Right, so let's take apart the case. There are 3 screws hold the retainer plate in place. That's the retainer plate. One side faces the diaphragm blades, the other side faces the shutter blades. Here's our diaphragm blades. Normally you can lift out a rosette of blades if there's enough of them in there, but they shouldn't stick together, just 2 blades. They're glued together with oil. Take those out. This is the settings plate. This is the plate that is swung backwards or forwards by the setting lever to swing those blades inwards or outwards. In the case, of course, there's not much exciting going on in here. It's just very dirty. Here we have the mechanism plate with the shutter blades in place. Those blades, of course, shouldn't stick. They should have fallen out under gravity. They're glued in place. 3 of them are stuck together. That's oil that's done that. Now all that needs to be cleaned. It may be that there are other marks on those blades that I would like to polish off, but possibly it's all just oil. The mechanism plate itself, does the blade actuating ring move freely? It's not too bad. I've seen worse examples than that. It's a bit stiff. Inevitably, the grease that's been used on this to lubricate it has dried out over time and become wax-like and sticky. And so it doesn't act as a good lubricant anymore. So these parts all need to be cleaned very carefully. This mechanism plate's quite marked there, and that really is graphite that I can see on those surfaces. Whether it was grease that was spread around or not, I don't know. I'm suspecting graphite powder looking at what I saw on the other side. So all of these pieces need to be cleaned, and when they're all cleaned, there's probably nothing broken there. It'll probably all go back together and function really well. The only weak link in this was the main spring. And the main spring looked quite tired. So I'll look into that.